The doors of the great hall burst open before Elena Voss even reached them, and the sound made her stomach twist. She had walked this hallway 100 times before, always with her head high, always as the woman who would one day rule beside Alpha King Damien Cross. Tonight was supposed to be different, only because it was supposed to be final. Tonight, in front of every wolf in the kingdom, she would finally be named Luna. She did not know yet that her life was about to break in half. The hall was packed. Torches lined the stone walls, throwing gold light over hundreds of faces turned toward the raised platform at the far end. Elena walked forward in a deep blue gown, her chin lifted, her pulse steady, because she had trained herself for years to look calm, even when her heart was racing. She had waited for this moment since she was a child. Her father had promised her to Damien when she was only 7 years old, and she had spent every year since preparing to be worthy of a crown. She reached the front of the crowd and found her place beside the platform, waiting for Damien to call her forward. He stood above the room in his dark formal coat, broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable in the way that used to make her feel safe. Tonight it made her uneasy. Something in his eyes refused to meet hers. Then the doors at the side of the hall opened, and a woman stepped through them. Elena did not recognize her. The woman had golden hair loose around her shoulders, sharp eyes, and a red dress that clung to her like a second skin. She walked with the confidence of someone who already believed she belonged there, and the crowd went silent as she crossed the floor toward Damien. Elena's stomach dropped. Damien reached down and took the woman's hand, lifting it high enough for the whole hall to see. He did not smile the way he used to smile at Elena. He smiled the way a man smiles when he has already made a decision and does not care who disagrees with it. "Wolves of Crosspack," Damien said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "Tonight, I name my Luna." For a moment, Elena thought she had misheard him. She waited for him to say her name. She waited for him to turn toward her, to reach for her hand the way he was supposed to, the way their families had planned for 18 years. Instead, he placed a silver circlet on the golden-haired woman's head, and the crowd, stunned into obedience, began to bow. "Her name is Celine," Damien continued. "She has no pack, no title, and no bloodline, and she is the only Luna I have ever wanted." Elena stood frozen in the middle of the hall, watching as every wolf around her lowered their eyes to the floor, leaving her the only person still standing upright, still staring at the man who had just erased her future in front of everyone she had ever known. She waited for someone to object. She waited for her father to step forward and demand an explanation, because surely this was some kind of mistake, some cruel misunderstanding that would be corrected the moment cooler heads returned. But when she turned to find him in the crowd, her father was already bowing with everyone else, his eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to look at her. That was the moment Elena understood. There was no mistake. There was no misunderstanding. She had been discarded, and everyone in the room already knew it before she did. Celine turned her head slightly and looked directly at Elena. It was not a look of pity. It was not even a look of triumph. It was simply the look of a woman confirming that a rival had been removed from the board, calm and satisfied, as though the outcome had never been in question. Elena felt heat rise in her face, but she refused to let it show as anger. She had learned long ago that a woman who lost control in front of a crowd of wolves lost more than her dignity. She lifted her chin instead, forced her shoulders back, and turned to walk out of the hall on her own, before anyone could escort her out. The walk felt endless. Every step echoed against the stone floor, and though no one spoke, she could feel hundreds of eyes following her, some curious, some cold, a few almost sympathetic but too afraid to show it. She kept her pace even. She did not run. She would not give any of them the satisfaction of watching her run. Only when the heavy doors closed behind her did she allow herself to stop, pressing one hand flat against the cool stone wall of the corridor to steady her breathing. Her whole body was shaking, though her face had not betrayed a single crack. Elena. She turned to find Marcus Vale standing a few feet away, one of the palace guards who had served her family for years. His expression was careful, guarded, the way people looked at someone they were afraid to be seen comforting. "You should not be here," Marcus said quietly. "Guards have been given orders." "Orders?" Elena repeated. The word tasted strange in her mouth. What orders, Marcus? He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything before he spoke a single word. You are to gather your belongings by morning, he said. The Alpha King has dissolved the marriage contract. You are no longer to remain within the palace grounds. Elena felt something cold settle into her chest, heavier than shock, heavier than grief. It was the sound of a door closing on 18 years of her life, all decided in a single sentence spoken by a man who could not even say it to her face. He could not tell me himself, she said, more to herself than to Marcus. I am sorry, Marcus said, and for once, it sounded like he meant it. I have my own orders. I cannot help you beyond this. Elena nodded slowly. She understood the position he was in, far better than he realized. Everyone in this palace had learned the same lesson she had just learned tonight. Loyalty to the Alpha King came before loyalty to anyone else, even when it meant abandoning someone who had once been kind to them. She walked the rest of the way to her chambers alone, her footsteps the only sound in the corridor. When she reached her door, she paused with her hand on the handle, looking back down the empty hallway one last time, as if some part of her still expected Damien to come after her, to explain, to apologize, to tell her this had all been some terrible test of her patience. No one came. Inside her room, Elena stood in the darkness for a long moment before she lit a single candle. The soft light revealed a room that had been hers since childhood, filled with small treasures collected over the years. A wooden box her mother had given her before she died, dried flowers pressed between the pages of old books, a hairpin Damien had once given her when they were both too young to understand what promises truly meant. She sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, and for the first time since the doors of the great hall had opened, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not anger yet, not even sadness in the way she expected. Just a strange, hollow disbelief, as though she were watching her own life happen to someone else from a great distance. A soft knock came at the door sometime later. Elena wiped her face quickly and opened it to find her old nursemaid, Grace Hollow, standing in the hallway with a small bundle of cloth in her arms. I heard, Grace said simply, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I am so sorry, child. Everyone seems to be sorry, Elena said, her voice flatter than she intended. No one seems surprised. Grace's face tightened, and Elena realized with a fresh wave of hurt that the older woman had not been surprised either. How long has this been planned? Elena asked quietly. How long have people known, while I stood there like a fool? Longer than any of us wanted to admit, Grace said. The Alpha King has been seeing that woman for months. Those close to the throne knew, but no one dared speak against him. You know how it is here. Silence is safer than honesty. Elena closed her eyes. Months. She had spent months preparing for a coronation that had never truly been hers to claim, while Damien had already chosen someone else in secret, letting her walk toward humiliation without a single warning. Where will I go? Elena asked, and the question surprised her with how small it sounded. Grace reached out and took her hand. Your father spoke to me earlier. He has arranged for you to be sent to Ashwood territory. It is far from here, and it is not what you deserve, but it is somewhere, Elena. It is a place to begin again. Ashwood, Elena repeated. She had heard the name before, always spoken with a note of pity or contempt. It was one of the outer territories, a struggling outpost pack far from the capital, poor, and largely forgotten by the cross bloodline that was supposed to protect it. They will not have prepared for you, Grace warned gently. It is not a kind place to arrive with nothing. Then I will arrive with nothing, Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. I have already lost everything that mattered tonight. What is left to be afraid of losing? Grace studied her for a long moment, something like sad admiration in her eyes. You have always been stronger than they gave you credit for, she said. Perhaps that is exactly why he was afraid of you. Elena did not answer. She was not sure yet if she believed that, but she let the words settle somewhere deep inside her, a small seed of something that was not quite hope, but was no longer only despair. She spent the rest of the night packing what little she was allowed to take, a few dresses, her mother's wooden box, some books, and the small amount of coin she had saved over the years, without ever expecting to need it. Everything else, The fine gowns and jewelry gifted to her as the future Luna, she left behind, folded neatly on the bed, as though returning them might return some small piece of her dignity along with them. By the time dawn broke over the palace, Elena stood at the edge of the courtyard, with a single bag at her feet, watching the sky turn pale gray above the towers she had called home her entire life. A modest carriage waited to take her toward Ashwood, arranged quietly by her father, who had not come to see her off himself. She was not surprised by that either. As the carriage began to move, Elena allowed herself one final look back at the palace, its stone towers catching the first light of morning. Somewhere inside those walls, Damien was likely still asleep beside the woman he had chosen, untroubled by what he had done to the woman he had promised to marry since childhood. Elena turned her eyes forward instead, toward the road ahead, toward a place she had never seen, and people who did not know her name. She did not know yet what waited for her in Ashwood. She did not know that within a matter of months, wolves from a dozen struggling territories would begin whispering her name with a very different kind of respect. She did not know that the crown she had lost in that great hall would one day feel small compared to what she was about to build with her own hands. She only knew, as the carriage rolled away from everything she had ever known, that she would not spend the rest of her life being someone's forgotten promise. Whatever came next, she would meet it standing upright, exactly as she had walked out of that hall the night before. The wheels of the carriage turned steadily beneath her, carrying her farther from the palace with every passing mile, and Elena Voss, once meant to be queen, closed her eyes and let the road ahead decide what she would become instead. The road to Ashwood took 4 days, and with every mile the land grew wilder and the towns grew smaller. Elena watched the scenery change through the small carriage window, farmland giving way to thick forest, paved roads giving way to packed dirt. She spoke little to the driver, an older man named Edwin, who had been hired for the journey, and clearly knew better than to ask questions about why a young woman with fine luggage was being sent to the poorest territory in the kingdom. By the 3rd day, Elena had stopped crying. Not because the pain had faded, but because she had made a quiet decision, somewhere between the 2nd night and the 3rd morning, lying awake in a rented room above a roadside inn. She decided that grief could travel with her, but it would not be allowed to lead. Whatever waited for her in Ashwood, she intended to meet it with clear eyes. The carriage finally slowed as the trees thinned out, revealing a cluster of low wooden buildings surrounded by a weathered fence. Ashwood was smaller than Elena had imagined, and far more tired. The main hall, which she assumed served as the pack's center of governance, had a roof patched with mismatched wood, and several of the surrounding houses looked as though they had not been properly repaired in years. A handful of wolves stopped what they were doing to watch the unfamiliar carriage roll to a stop in the square. Elena stepped down slowly, smoothing her travel-worn dress, and felt dozens of curious eyes settle on her at once. No one moved to greet her. No one seemed to know who she was, or why she had come. "You there," a rough voice called out. An older man approached from the direction of the main hall, thin and stooped, dressed in clothes that had clearly been mended many times. His eyes were sharp despite his frail appearance. "State your business. We don't get many carriages out this way." "My name is Elena Voss," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I have been sent from the capital. I believe arrangements were made for my arrival." The man's expression shifted the moment he heard her surname, though not into the recognition she expected. Instead, something like weary understanding crossed his face, as though he had heard rumors already and was only now confirming them. "You're the one the Alpha King cast aside," he said bluntly. There was no cruelty in his voice, only tired honesty. "Word travels slower out here, but it travels." Elena felt her cheeks warm, but she refused to look away. That is one way to describe it. The old man studied her for a long moment, before extending a hand. "Callum Brant, I lead what's left of this pack, though calling myself an alpha these days is more courtesy than truth. My health isn't what it used to be, and neither is Ashwood." Elena shook his hand firmly. "Then perhaps we are both starting from somewhere difficult." A faint, surprised smile crossed Callum's face at that, quickly hidden. "Come inside. You'll want food and rest before you see the rest of what you've inherited." The main hall was as worn on the inside as it appeared from outside. Long tables lined a room with a low ceiling, and the fire in the hearth burned smaller than it should have, as though even the wood was being rationed. A young woman with dark hair pulled back tightly, perhaps a few years younger than Elena, glanced up from sorting through a stack of papers at one of the tables. "This is Nora Finch," Callum said. "She keeps what records we have. Nora, this is Elena Voss, sent to us from the capital." Nora's eyes flicked over Elena's fine, if travel-stained, clothing, with an expression that was not quite hostile, but was far from welcoming. "We don't usually get guests who used to live in palaces," she said. "I don't expect special treatment," Elena replied evenly. "I would rather be useful than comfortable." Something in Nora's posture eased slightly at that, though she did not fully relax. "We'll see." Callum gestured for Elena to sit, and had a bowl of simple stew brought to her, along with bread that was slightly stale but still filling. As she ate, she studied the hall around her, noting the empty tables, the thin faces of the wolves who passed through, the way even Callum himself seemed to be conserving his strength as he spoke. "How many wolves remain in Ashwood?" Elena asked between bites. "Fewer than there should be," Callum admitted. "The young ones leave when they're old enough, looking for better prospects in the larger territories. Can't say I blame them. We haven't had proper support from the capital in years. Trade routes dried up, hunting grounds have been contested by neighboring packs, and half our stores were lost to a bad winter 2 years back that we never fully recovered from. And the Alpha King has done nothing to help," Elena said, though it was less a question than a statement. Callum's laugh was dry and humorless. The Alpha King barely remembers Ashwood exists, unless he needs somewhere convenient to send people he'd rather forget. The words landed with more weight than Callum likely intended, and Elena set down her spoon, meeting his gaze directly. "Then let me be honest with you as well," she said. "I did not come here by choice, and I have very little to offer in the way of title or wealth. But I was raised to understand how a territory should be managed, how records should be kept, how trade should be balanced, and how a pack survives even in difficult seasons. If you will allow it, I would like to make myself useful here, rather than simply occupy a room and wait for time to pass." Nora looked up sharply from her papers, clearly not expecting such a direct offer. Callum studied Elena for a long moment, his tired eyes assessing her with more attention than before. "You've been raised for a palace, not a struggling outpost," he said carefully. "Forgive me for doubting that the two experiences translate easily." "Perhaps not," Elena agreed, "but I have spent 18 years learning how systems function, even if I never expected to build one from nothing. I would rather try and fail than sit idle in a room feeling sorry for myself. I think I have earned the right to at least attempt something useful." There was a long pause, then Callum nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "Nora will show you our records tomorrow. What's left of them, at least. If you can find a way to make sense of the mess we've become, I won't stand in your way." That night, Elena was given a small room at the back of the main hall, sparse but clean, with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the dark tree line beyond the fence. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the outpost settling into night, so different from the constant hum of activity within the palace walls. She thought of Damien only once that night, briefly, before pushing the thought away. There was no use dwelling on a version of her life that no longer existed. She had a new task in front of her now, however small it seemed compared to what she had once expected to inherit. The next morning, Nora led her to a cramped back room filled with disorganized ledgers, half of them water-damaged, the ink faded on pages that had clearly not been properly reviewed in years. Elena sat down at the desk and began sorting through them, and within an hour, she understood far more clearly why Ashwood was struggling. Supplies were being distributed unevenly, with no clear record of what had been given to whom. Trade agreements with neighboring territories had lapsed without renewal, some simply forgotten in the chaos of Callum's declining health. Hunting rights along the eastern border were being disputed by a rival pack, and no one in Ashwood had responded formally in over a year, allowing the other territory to slowly claim more land through simple neglect. "This is fixable," Elena murmured, more to herself than to Nora, who was watching her from across the room with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You say that like it's simple," Nora said. "It is not simple," Elena replied, looking up. "But it is possible. Disorganization is not the same as ruin. Ashwood has resources. It has people, and it has land. What it lacks is structure and a clear plan. Those things can be built. Nora crossed her arms, studying Elena carefully. Why do you care? You didn't choose to come here. You could sit in that back room feeling sorry for yourself for the next year, and no one would blame you. Elena set down the ledger she had been reading and met Nora's gaze directly. Because feeling sorry for myself will not change what happened to me, and it will certainly not build a future. I lost the life I expected to have. I am not interested in losing the rest of my life along with it. For the first time since Elena's arrival, something like genuine respect flickered across Nora's face. Fair enough, she said. Where do you want to start? Elena looked down at the scattered ledgers in front of her, then back up at Nora, a small but determined resolve settling into her chest, the first steady feeling she had experienced since the doors of the Great Hall had closed behind her. We start with the food stores, Elena said. No pack survives long on empty stomachs and broken trust. If I am going to help Ashwood stand again, I want to begin with the most basic need first, and build outward from there. Nora studied her for a long moment, before finally nodding, a faint, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. All right then, she said. Let's see what you're actually capable of, palace girl. Elena allowed herself the smallest smile in return, the first genuine one since she had left the capital behind. Whatever Ashwood had been before her arrival, she intended to make certain it would not remain the same for long. The following weeks passed in a blur of work that left Elena's hands rough and her body exhausted by nightfall, a kind of tired she had never experienced within palace walls. She spent her mornings in the storage cellars, counting grain sacks and dried meat, cross-referencing what remained against what Ashwood would need to survive the coming season. She spent her afternoons walking the perimeter of the territory with Nora, learning the boundaries of the land, the condition of the fences, the state of the hunting grounds that had been slowly lost to a neighboring pack through years of silence and neglect. What she found troubled her more each day. Ashwood was not simply poor. It was a territory that had been allowed to fail through indifference, both from its own leadership and from a capital that had long since stopped paying attention. How long has the border dispute with Thornfield been going on? Elena asked one afternoon, standing at the edge of a tree line where a faded marker post leaned at an odd angle, clearly ignored for years. 3 years, maybe 4, Nora said, kicking at the base of the post. Thornfield's Alpha started sending hunting parties onto our side gradually. First it was just a few wolves testing the boundary. When no one stopped them, they kept pushing further in. Now half our best hunting ground is effectively theirs, even though the old maps still say otherwise. And Callum never challenged it? Nora's jaw tightened. Callum's health started failing around the same time Thornfield started pushing. He didn't have the strength for a fight, and none of us had the authority to challenge another Alpha in his place. So we just let it happen. Elena stared out at the trees, imagining the boundary as it should have been. The resources that rightfully belonged to Ashwood, slipping away one quiet year at a time. It reminded her, in an uncomfortable way, of how her own future had been taken from her, not through open confrontation, but through quiet, patient erosion, while no one intervened. That changes, Elena said firmly. Not today, not with force we don't have. But it changes. Nora glanced at her sideways. You talk like someone who's used to giving orders that get followed. I was raised to lead a kingdom, Elena said simply. Leading a single territory should not be beyond me, even one as troubled as this. Over the following days, Elena began drafting a plan, staying up late by candlelight in her small room, filling pages with organized notes the way she had been trained to do since childhood. She mapped out which stores needed immediate rationing, which fields could be replanted before the season turned, and which trade routes might be reopened with neighboring territories that had no particular loyalty to Thornfield. She brought her plan to Callum on a quiet evening, finding him seated near the hearth, looking more frail than he had even a few weeks earlier. You've been busy, he said, eyeing the stack of papers in her hands, with something between amusement and disbelief. I have found the source of most of Ashwood's troubles, Elena said, sitting across from him. It is not a lack of resources. It is a lack of organization and a long absence of decisive leadership. I do not say that to insult what you have managed under difficult circumstances. I say it because it means the situation can be corrected. Callum studied her for a long moment, then gestured for her to continue. Elena walked him through her plan point by point, redistributing the remaining food stores more evenly to stretch through the coming months, assigning specific wolves to oversee grain rationing rather than leaving it disorganized, and reaching out quietly to 2 smaller territories bordering Ashwood that had no particular allegiance to Thornfield, in hopes of re-establishing trade that had lapsed years earlier. "And the border dispute?" Callum asked when she finished. "That will take more than paperwork," Elena admitted. "For now, I want to focus on making Ashwood strong enough internally that it can eventually stand up to that kind of pressure. A pack that cannot feed itself has no leverage to reclaim contested land." Callum was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, as though weighing memories against the plan in front of him. "You remind me of my own daughter," he said eventually. "She left for the capital years ago, chasing a better life. I don't blame her. But it's rare to see someone choose to build something in a place like this, rather than simply endure it until they can leave. I have nowhere else to go," Elena said honestly. "So I intend to make this place worth staying in." Callum nodded slowly, then gave his approval to her plan with a tired but genuine smile. "Do what you think is best. Gods know none of the rest of us have managed much these past few years." With Callum's blessing, Elena began implementing her plan the following morning, and Nora, somewhat to Elena's surprise, became her most consistent ally in the process. Together, they organized the remaining wolves of Ashwood into small working groups, assigning specific responsibilities rather than leaving tasks to fall through the cracks as they had for years. Progress was slow at first. Many of the older wolves were skeptical of a stranger from the capital, telling them how to manage a territory she had lived in for less than a month. Elena did not argue with their doubts. Instead, she worked alongside them, hauling grain sacks herself, mending fences with her own hands, proving through action, rather than words, that she intended to share in the labor, rather than simply direct it from a distance. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. A young hunter named Owen Barrett, who had been openly dismissive of Elena during her first week, found himself grudgingly impressed when she personally negotiated a fair trade agreement with a neighboring territory for extra grain, in exchange for Ashwood's skilled leatherwork, a trade no one else in the pack had thought to attempt in years. "Didn't expect a palace girl to know how to haggle," Owen admitted one evening, watching Elena finalize the details of the agreement with a visiting trader. "I spent years watching my father manage negotiations for the capital," Elena replied. "It seems I absorbed more than I realized." Word of Ashwood's quiet improvement began to spread slowly beyond its own borders, carried by traders and travelers who noticed the difference in the outpost's organization compared to previous seasons. It was not dramatic news, nothing that would reach the ears of the capital or draw attention from the Alpha King's court, but it was enough to earn Ashwood a small measure of renewed respect among its immediate neighbors. One evening, several weeks into her efforts, Elena stood at the edge of the territory, watching the sun set over fields that had recently been replanted, the first real color returning to land that had been neglected for years. Nora joined her quietly, arms crossed against the evening chill. "You've done more for this place in a month than the rest of us managed in years," Nora said. "We did it together," Elena corrected. "I only organized what was already here." Nora shook her head slightly. "That's not entirely true, and you know it. Most people in your position would have spent the last month feeling sorry for themselves, waiting for someone to rescue them from exile. You did the opposite." Elena considered the observation for a long moment, watching the last light fade over the horizon. "I do not think there is any rescue coming for me," she said quietly. "I think if I want a life worth living, I will have to build it myself, piece by piece, exactly like this." "Well," Nora said, a faint smile crossing her face, "for what it's worth, I think you're building something worth watching." Elena allowed herself a small, genuine smile in return, feeling something she had not expected to feel again so soon after leaving the capital behind. A quiet, steady sense of purpose, entirely her own, owed to no one else's approval. As the days grew shorter and the season began to shift toward autumn, Ashwood continued its slow but steady transformation under Elena's guidance. The storage cellars grew more organized, the fields more productive, and the wolves of the territory more united than they had been in years. Elena did not know yet how far this quiet rebuilding would eventually carry her, or how the small outpost she had once viewed as a place of exile would soon become the foundation of something far greater than she had ever imagined for herself. But standing at the edge of Ashwood's fields as autumn approached, watching a territory slowly come back to life beneath her own careful hands, Elena Voss felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt, for the first time since that terrible night in the Great Hall, genuinely hopeful about what her future might still hold. The stranger appeared at the edge of Ashwood, on a cold morning in early autumn, walking alone out of the tree line, as though he had simply materialized from the forest itself. Elena was overseeing the final stages of the grain harvest, when Owen came jogging across the field toward her, his expression tense. "There's someone at the north fence," Owen said. "Says he wants to speak with whoever's in charge." Elena wiped her hands on her apron and followed Owen toward the fence, curious rather than afraid. Ashwood rarely received visitors, and those who did come were usually traders with familiar faces, not solitary strangers appearing without warning. The man waiting at the fence was tall, with dark hair and sharp gray eyes that studied Elena with unsettling intensity as she approached. He wore simple traveling clothes, worn from the road but well-maintained, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that reminded Elena, uncomfortably, of the way palace guards used to stand at attention. "I'm looking for whoever is responsible for the changes happening in this territory," the stranger said, his voice calm and measured. "Word has reached farther than you might expect." "That would be me, in part," Elena said carefully. "My name is Elena Voss. May I ask who is asking?" "Kieran," the man said simply, offering no surname. "I've been traveling through the smaller territories for some time now. Most of them are barely surviving. Yours is the first I've seen actually improving." "And why does that interest you?" Elena asked, keeping her tone polite but guarded. There was something about the stranger's manner that suggested he was choosing his words carefully, revealing only what he intended to reveal. Kieran's gaze swept briefly over the fields behind her, the organized rows of harvested grain, the repaired fences, the general sense of order that had not existed in Ashwood only weeks earlier. Because competence is rare these days, especially in territories the capital has forgotten. I have my own reasons for taking an interest in packs that manage to survive despite being abandoned. That is not much of an answer, Elena said. A faint, almost approving smile crossed Kieran's face. No, it isn't. Perhaps we should discuss it somewhere more private, if you're willing. I have a proposal that might interest you, and Ashwood. Elena hesitated, glancing at Owen, who was watching the exchange with visible suspicion. She trusted her own instincts more than she trusted a stranger's polished words, but something about Kieran's directness, and the fact that he had clearly done his research before arriving, made her curious enough to hear him out. Very well, she said, but you will speak with Callum as well. I do not make decisions for Ashwood alone. Kieran nodded, seemingly unbothered by the condition. That seems reasonable. They walked together toward the main hall, Owen trailing a careful distance behind, clearly unwilling to leave Elena alone with an unfamiliar wolf, regardless of how calm he appeared. Callum received them in the main hall, his sharp eyes assessing Kieran with the same wariness Elena had felt at the fence. State your business, Callum said, without preamble. Kieran took a seat across from them, his manner respectful, but unhurried. I have spent the last several months traveling through the outer territories, the ones the capital has largely abandoned. I have seen packs collapse from neglect, from poor leadership, from an alpha king, more concerned with his own comfort than the well-being of those he is meant to protect. That is not exactly a secret, Callum said dryly. No, Kieran agreed. But what is less known is that several of these struggling territories have begun quietly discussing an alternative. A coalition of outer packs, working together for mutual protection and trade, independent of the capital's failing support. I have been meeting with a handful of alphas who are interested in exactly that kind of arrangement. Elena's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression neutral. You are describing something that sounds very close to rebellion. I am describing survival, Kieran corrected. Nothing more. The capital has made it clear it has no interest in supporting territories like Ashwood. If the outer packs cannot rely on the Alpha King for protection or resources, then they must rely on each other instead. That is not rebellion. That is simply reality. Callum exchanged a long look with Elena before speaking again. And what exactly are you proposing for Ashwood? An alliance, Kieran said simply. Ashwood has already proven, in a remarkably short amount of time, that it can rebuild itself under strong leadership. His gaze flicked briefly toward Elena as he spoke, and she felt a small flush of something she did not entirely want to identify. A coalition of territories like this one, working together, sharing resources and protection, would be far harder for a rival pack like Thornfield to push around. It would also be far harder for the capital to continue ignoring. Elena considered his words carefully, aware of the risk embedded in what he was suggesting. An open coalition of outer territories, however framed, would almost certainly be viewed as a threat by the capital eventually, regardless of how reasonably it began. You understand what you are asking, Elena said slowly. If this coalition grows strong enough to be noticed, it will not remain unnoticed by the Alpha King forever. I am aware, Kieran said, meeting her gaze directly. I do not say this lightly, Elena Voss. I know exactly who you are, and exactly what happened to you at the capital. I am not asking you to build something quiet and comfortable. I am asking you to help build something strong enough that no one, not even an Alpha King, could dismiss it easily again. The words landed with more weight than Elena expected, striking closer to her own private thoughts than she was entirely comfortable admitting to a stranger. She had spent the last month rebuilding Ashwood out of necessity and stubborn pride, refusing to be defined by the humiliation she had suffered at the capital. She had not yet allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to build something powerful enough to matter beyond Ashwood's own borders. Why me? She asked quietly. Why not approach Callum alone, or another territory entirely? Because Callum himself would tell you his health is failing, Kieran said, glancing respectfully toward the older man, who did not deny it. And because in less than 2 months, you have accomplished more in this territory than most leaders manage in years. I do not offer this partnership lightly. I offer it because I believe you are capable of leading something far larger than a single struggling outpost. Callum was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them with the careful attention of a man who had lived through enough disappointment to be cautious of easy promises. And what do you gain from this, exactly? He asked Kieran directly. Men do not offer alliances without reason. Something shifted briefly in Kieran's expression, a flicker of something guarded that he quickly smoothed over. I have my own history with the capital, he said carefully. Let us say I have reasons to want to see the outer territories grow strong, independent of the Alpha King's failing leadership. Beyond that, I would rather not elaborate further tonight. Elena noted the evasion, but did not press it, sensing instinctively that pushing too hard, too soon, would gain her nothing. Instead, she turned the conversation toward practical matters, asking which territories had already expressed interest in the coalition, what resources they could realistically contribute, and how such an arrangement might function without collapsing under its own ambition. They spoke late into the evening, Kieran answering her questions with careful precision, clearly a man who had thought through the logistics of his proposal far more thoroughly than his initial vague explanation suggested. By the time the conversation finally wound down, Elena found herself cautiously intrigued, despite the obvious risks involved. I will not agree to anything tonight, she said finally, as Kieran prepared to take his leave for a nearby inn. This decision affects the entire territory, not only myself. I will need time to consider it properly, and to discuss it further with Callum and the others. That is fair, Kieran said, seemingly unbothered by the delay. I will remain in the area for a few days, if you are willing to continue this conversation. Elena nodded, and Kieran offered a small, respectful bow before departing into the evening, leaving Elena and Callum alone in the quiet hall. What do you make of him? Callum asked once the door had closed. Elena considered the question carefully. He is careful with his words. He is hiding something, though I could not say what. But everything he said about the outer territories was true, and everything he proposed was logical, even if it carries real risk. And the way he looked at you? Callum asked, a faint knowing note in his voice. Elena felt her cheeks warm slightly, and she busied herself gathering papers to avoid meeting his gaze directly. That is irrelevant to the decision at hand. Callum chuckled softly, though he did not push the matter further. Perhaps. But I have lived long enough to recognize when two people are more aware of each other than they are willing to admit. Elena did not respond, though she could not entirely deny the small flicker of curiosity Kieran had stirred in her, separate from the practical considerations of his proposal. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her the way he had, not as a discarded fiancée or a pitiable exile, but as someone whose strength and capability were genuinely worth noticing. That night, lying awake in her small room, Elena turned Kieran's proposal over carefully in her mind, weighing the risks against the possibilities. An alliance of outer territories was a dangerous thing to build, certain to draw unwanted attention eventually. But Ashwood alone, however much progress it had made, remained vulnerable to threats like Thornfield's continued encroachment on its borders. Perhaps, she thought, staring up at the dark ceiling above her narrow bed, it was time to stop thinking only in terms of survival and start thinking in terms of what Ashwood, and territories like it, might actually be capable of becoming, if given the chance to stand together rather than struggle alone. By morning, Elena had made her decision. Elena found Kieran the following morning at the small inn on the edge of Ashwood, seated near a window, with a cup of tea cooling untouched in front of him, as though he had been waiting since dawn for her decision. He looked up as she entered, something careful and hopeful crossing his face before he schooled it back into calm neutrality. "I have spoken with Callum, and with the senior members of our pack," Elena said, taking the seat across from him without preamble. "We are willing to explore this coalition, on certain conditions." "Name them," Kieran said simply. "Ashwood retains full authority over its own internal affairs," Elena said. "We will share resources and coordinate protection with other territories in the coalition, but no outside pack will dictate how Ashwood governs itself. Second, any commitment we make will be reviewed and adjusted as circumstances change. I will not bind this territory to a permanent arrangement based on a handful of conversations with a stranger, however convincing his reasoning may be." A faint smile crossed Kieran's face. "Reasonable conditions. I would have been surprised if you had agreed to anything less. And I want to know more about you," Elena added, watching him carefully. "If I am going to help build something with you, I need to understand who I am actually working alongside." Something flickered behind Kieran's eyes, brief and guarded, before he nodded slowly. "That is fair. I will tell you what I can, though I ask for your patience regarding certain details, for reasons that will become clear in time." Elena studied him for a moment, weighing whether to push further, then decided to let the matter rest for now. Trust, she had learned recently, was built slowly, through action rather than demand. Over the following weeks, Kieran proved himself remarkably useful to Ashwood's continued growth. He had extensive knowledge of the surrounding territories, their leadership, their strengths and weaknesses, gathered through months of careful travel that suggested a level of purpose beyond simple curiosity. He introduced Elena to several alphas from neighboring outposts, each cautiously interested in the idea of a coalition, but hesitant to commit, without seeing further proof that Ashwood's recovery was more than a temporary improvement. Elena took each meeting seriously, presenting Ashwood's progress with careful precision, backed by the organized records she and Nora had spent weeks compiling. She spoke of shared hunting grounds, coordinated trade routes, and mutual defense agreements that would benefit every territory involved, without requiring any single pack to surrender its independence. Her approach won over skeptics one careful conversation at a time. A neighboring alpha named Priya Solane, leading a modest territory to the west, was among the first to formally commit to the coalition, impressed by Elena's clear grasp of practical logistics. "You think like someone who has actually studied how kingdoms function," Priya observed during one visit, watching Elena finalize trade terms with quiet efficiency. "Most leaders out here just react to whatever crisis is happening at the moment." "I was raised to understand how systems function, even if I never expected to use that knowledge quite this way," Elena replied, a wry note in her voice. Kieran, standing nearby, caught her eye briefly, something like quiet admiration in his expression that he did not bother to hide. As the coalition slowly took shape, Elena found herself spending more time in Kieran's company, discussing strategy late into the evenings, debating the merits of various trade proposals, and gradually learning small pieces of his guarded history. He spoke carefully of a childhood spent far from any settled territory, of years learning to survive without the protection of a formal pack, though he remained deliberately vague about the reasons behind that upbringing. "You avoid certain questions very skillfully," Elena observed one evening, as they reviewed a map of the coalition's growing territory spread across the table between them. "I have my reasons," Kieran said, not unkindly. "There are things about my past that would complicate matters if revealed too soon. I promise you, Elena, when the time is right, you will understand everything." "That sounds like the kind of thing someone says right before revealing something troubling," Elena said, only half joking. Kieran's expression grew momentarily serious. "It is not troubling in the way you might fear. But it is significant, and I would rather you trust my judgment in choosing when to share it, given everything else we are currently building together." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing her instinctive curiosity against the trust that had slowly grown between them over the past weeks. Despite his careful evasions, Kieran had proven himself reliable in every practical matter, consistently honest about the risks and challenges facing the coalition, never once attempting to manipulate her into a decision she was not fully prepared to make. "Very well," she said finally. "I will trust your judgment, for now." Something like relief crossed Kieran's face, quickly replaced by his usual careful composure. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That trust means more to me than you likely realize." As autumn deepened into winter, the coalition continued to grow, drawing in territories that had spent years surviving in isolation, now finding strength in careful cooperation. Ashwood, once the most forgotten outpost in the region, became something of an unofficial center for the growing alliance, its main hall regularly filled with visiting alphas and traders, discussing shared strategies for the season ahead. Callum, despite his declining health, watched the transformation with quiet pride, often remarking to Elena that he had never expected to see Ashwood become relevant to anything beyond its own survival. "You have given this territory something it lost a long time ago," he told her one evening, as they watched a fresh snowfall settle over fields that had once lain neglected and are now carefully maintained. "Purpose." "We built it together," Elena reminded him gently, though she could not fully deny the quiet pride she felt watching Ashwood's transformation unfold under her guidance. News of the coalition's growth inevitably began to spread beyond the outer territories, carried by traders and travelers into the more populated regions closer to the capital. Elena knew it was only a matter of time before word reached the palace itself, before Damien became aware that the fiancé he had so publicly discarded was quietly building something far more significant than anyone had expected from a woman sent away in disgrace. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that the thought no longer filled her with dread the way it once might have. Instead, it settled into something closer to calm anticipation, a sense that whatever reaction eventually came from the capital, she would meet it from a position far stronger than the one she had left behind. Late one evening, as she prepared to retire for the night, Elena found Kieran waiting near the entrance of the main hall, an unusually serious expression on his face. "I received word today from a contact within Thornfield's territory," he said, without preamble. "It seems reports of Ashwood's growth have already reached the capital. Damien Cross has taken notice." Elena felt a familiar tightening in her chest, though she kept her expression steady. "What kind of notice?" "The kind that suggests he is unsettled by what you have built here," Kieran said carefully. "Whether that leads to conflict or negotiation, I cannot yet say. But I believe it would be wise for us to prepare for either possibility." Elena stood quietly for a long moment, absorbing the weight of his words, feeling the careful, steady progress of the past months crystallize into something with far greater consequences than she had initially imagined. She thought briefly of the woman who had walked out of the capital in disgrace only a season earlier, and felt, with quiet certainty, that this new challenge, however daunting, was one she was finally prepared to face. "Then we prepare," she said simply. "Whatever comes next, Ashwood, and this coalition, will not be caught unprepared." Kieran studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before offering a small, respectful nod. "I never doubted that for a moment," he said quietly, and turned to begin the preparations that would carry them both into whatever confrontation lay ahead. Within the capital, far from the quiet fields of Ashwood, the palace that Elena had once called home was beginning to feel the strain of a leadership no one had truly wanted. Celine sat upon the Luna's seat with the silver circlet resting on her golden hair, but the confidence she had carried into the great hall on the night of her coronation had grown thin with each passing month, worn away by responsibilities she had never been prepared to carry. She had expected the title to bring comfort, admiration, and ease. Instead, it brought endless demands, disputes between lesser pacts that required careful judgment, trade negotiations that required patience she did not possess, and a growing unease among the palace staff who had once served Elena and now found themselves comparing every one of Celine's decisions unfavorably to the woman who had been cast aside. The Southern Territories are requesting additional grain shipments before winter. A palace advisor named Edwin Cross, a distant cousin of Damien's, informed her one morning, laying a stack of papers on the table in front of her. Their harvest fell short this season. Celine barely glanced at the documents. Tell them to manage with what they have. We cannot spare resources for every territory that fails to plan properly. Edwin hesitated. Lady Elena, when she oversaw such matters, typically arranged partial support in exchange for future trade concessions. It maintained loyalty among the smaller pacts without depleting the capital's own reserves. Celine's expression darkened at the mention of Elena's name, a reaction that had become increasingly common among the staff, who seemed to invoke her predecessor's methods with growing frequency whenever Celine's own decisions proved lacking. I am not interested in how things were done before, she said sharply. Deny the request. Edwin bowed stiffly and left without further argument, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he did not agree with her judgment. It was a pattern that had repeated itself countless times over recent months. Celine making decisions driven by impatience or insecurity, followed by quiet corrections from advisors working to minimize the damage before it reached Damien's attention. Damien himself had grown increasingly distant, spending long hours away from the palace on matters he rarely explained, leaving Celine to manage the daily governance of the pack largely on her own. What had once felt like an exciting position of power had slowly transformed into an exhausting burden she felt increasingly unprepared to carry. You seem troubled, Damien remarked one evening, finding her seated alone in their private chambers, staring blankly at a stack of unresolved reports. The Southern Territories are unhappy, Celine said, not looking up. The eastern trade routes are experiencing delays no one can properly explain, and Thornfield's Alpha has been requesting an audience for weeks regarding some dispute with a neighboring outpost, though I have been putting him off because I do not fully understand the situation. Damien frowned slightly. You are the Luna. These matters fall under your authority. I know that, Celine snapped, more sharply than she intended, but no one properly explained to me what that authority actually required. I was crowned in a single evening, Damien, with no preparation, no guidance, nothing beyond a circlet placed on my head. Something flickered across Damien's face, guilt perhaps, or simple discomfort, quickly smoothed away into his usual composed expression. Elena had years to prepare for this role, he said quietly. I understand the transition has been difficult. Celine's eyes narrowed at the comparison, a comparison that seemed to follow her everywhere within these walls, whispered by staff, implied by advisors, and now spoken aloud by Damien himself. Perhaps you should have considered that before crowning me in her place, she said, the words sharper than she intended, though she did not take them back. Damien did not respond immediately, and the silence between them stretched uncomfortably long. Celine watched him carefully, searching his expression for some sign of the certainty he had shown the night of her coronation, the absolute confidence that had convinced her, and everyone else in that great hall, that his decision was final and unwavering. She found, with growing unease, that the certainty seemed to have quietly faded, replaced by something she did not fully recognize, though it looked uncomfortably close to doubt. Reports of Ashwood's unlikely recovery had begun reaching the palace through various channels over recent weeks, first as vague rumors dismissed as exaggeration, then as increasingly detailed accounts that were harder to ignore. Palace staff spoke of it quietly among themselves, careful never to raise the subject directly in front of Damien or Celine, though the whispers grew louder with each passing month. The outpost has organized a coalition, Edwin reported carefully, during one private meeting with Damien, choosing his words with obvious caution. Several of the smaller territories have joined, coordinating trade and mutual defense independent of the capital's oversight. Damien's expression remained carefully neutral, though something tightened behind his eyes. And Lady Elena is leading this coalition? By most accounts, yes, Edwin confirmed. Ashwood's transformation over these past months has been remarkable by all reports. What was once the most neglected territory in the region has become something of a model for the other outposts. Damien said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze distant, as though wrestling with something he was not prepared to voice aloud. "Keep me informed of any further developments," he said finally, dismissing Edwin without further comment. Alone in his study that evening, Damien found himself staring at an old map of the kingdom's territories, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the small, unremarkable marker labeled Ashwood, a territory he had once dismissed so easily as a convenient place to send away an inconvenient obligation. He thought, uncomfortably, of Elena as he had last seen her, standing frozen in the middle of the great hall, her expression carefully composed even as her world collapsed around her. He had expected her exile to Ashwood to be the end of the matter, a quiet resolution to a decision he had made for reasons he still struggled to fully articulate, even to himself. He had not expected her to transform that exile into something that now demanded his attention, whether he wanted to give it or not. Meanwhile, within the palace's public gatherings, dissatisfaction with Celine's leadership continued to grow, quiet at first, then increasingly open among the lesser nobility and pack representatives who had grown frustrated with her erratic decisions and evident inexperience. Whispered comparisons to Elena became more frequent, more pointed, carried through the palace corridors in a way that Celine could not ignore, no matter how she tried. "They still speak her name as though she were still Luna," Celine said bitterly one evening, standing before her mirror, the silver circlet resting heavily on her golden hair. "I wear this crown, and still they compare me to a woman who no longer even lives within these walls." "Give it time," Damien said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "The pack will adjust." Celine turned to face him directly, something sharp and unguarded in her expression. "Will they? Or will Ashwood's coalition continue to grow, drawing more territories away from the capital's authority with each passing month, while I sit here failing to manage even the disputes that remain within our own borders?" Damien did not have an answer for her, and the absence of his usual confident reassurance settled uncomfortably between them, a silence neither of them seemed willing to break. Outside the palace walls, far beyond the reach of Celine's uncertain leadership, Ashwood's coalition continued its steady, careful growth, each territory strengthened by cooperation, each victory building toward something that no longer resembled the desperate survival Elena had once fought for in her earliest weeks of exile. The kingdom, slowly but unmistakably, was beginning to shift. Winter had fully settled over Ashwood by the time Damien Cross arrived at its borders, unannounced and accompanied by only a small escort. A deliberate choice meant to signal that his visit was not intended as a show of force. Elena received word of his approach from a scout well before his party reached the outpost, giving her time to prepare, though nothing could have fully readied her for the strange mixture of emotions that settled over her upon hearing his name spoken aloud again after so many months. "You do not have to meet with him," Nora said quietly, standing beside her as they watched the distant riders approach across the snow-covered fields. "You owe him nothing." "I know," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "But avoiding him accomplishes nothing either. Better to face this directly, on my own terms, in my own territory." Kieran appeared at her other side, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena had grown skilled enough at reading him over recent months to notice the slight tension in his shoulders. "I will be present for the meeting," he said, not quite a question. "Yes," Elena said, "I want you there." The main hall had been transformed considerably since Elena's arrival months earlier, no longer the sparse, struggling space she had first walked into, but a place that now reflected genuine order and quiet strength. She stood at its center as Damien entered, flanked by 2 guards who remained near the door while he approached alone. He looked much the same as she remembered, though something in his bearing seemed less certain than it had been the night he crowned Selene in front of the entire kingdom. His eyes swept briefly over the hall, taking in the organized efficiency of the space, before settling on Elena with an expression she could not quite read. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been surprise, or perhaps something closer to regret. "You look well." "Damien," she replied evenly, offering no further pleasantries. "I understand you have traveled a long way. I assume this is not simply a social visit." Something flickered across his face at her directness, a small crack in his composed exterior. "No," he admitted. "It is not." He glanced briefly toward Kieran, standing silently at Elena's side, before returning his attention to her. "May we speak privately?" "Anything you wish to discuss with me can be said in front of Kieran," Elena said firmly. "He is my closest advisor in matters concerning this coalition, and I have no secrets from him regarding Ashwood's affairs." Damien's jaw tightened slightly at the implication, though he did not argue the point. "Very well," he said. "I will be direct then. Reports of what you have built here have reached the capital, Elena, a coalition of territories, operating independently of the Crown's authority, growing stronger with each passing season. I would be a poor Alpha King if I did not take notice of something with such significant implications for the kingdom's stability." "You mean you would be a poor Alpha King if you did not take notice of something threatening your authority," Elena said, her voice calm but pointed. Damien did not deny the correction. "Call it what you wish. The outcome remains the same. I have come to understand your intentions and to discuss how this coalition's growth might be managed in a way that benefits both Ashwood and the capital, rather than creating unnecessary conflict between us." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the manipulation she half expected to find beneath his careful words, though she found instead something that looked closer to genuine uncertainty, an Alpha King who had arrived without a clear plan, hoping instead to gauge her intentions before committing to any particular course of action. "Ashwood's coalition was built out of necessity," Elena said. "For years, the outer territories were left to struggle without meaningful support from the capital. We did not build this alliance to threaten your throne, Damien. We built it because no one else was willing to ensure these territories could survive, let alone thrive. And yet it has grown into something considerably larger than simple survival," Damien countered, though there was less accusation in his tone than she expected. "Priya Solene's territory, the outposts along the eastern border, even portions of Thornfield's disputed lands, all now operating under an arrangement that answers to you rather than to the Crown." "They answer to their own interests," Elena corrected. "The coalition operates through cooperation, not command. Every territory involved retains its own governance. We simply share resources and mutual protection, something the capital failed to provide for years." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly around the hall again, taking in the evidence of Ashwood's transformation with an expression Elena could not fully interpret. "You have built something impressive here," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "I will not deny that." "Did you expect otherwise?" Elena asked, unable to fully keep a note of challenge from her voice. "You sent me here, believing I would simply fade into irrelevance, Damien. I understand that expectation clearly enough, even if you never said it directly." Something in his expression shifted, guilt flickering briefly beneath his composed exterior. "That was never my intention," he said, though the words sounded uncertain even to Elena's ears. "Was it not?" Elena asked. "You crowned another woman in front of the entire kingdom without a single word of warning to me beforehand. You dissolved our engagement through a guard rather than facing me directly. Whatever your intention truly was, the outcome was clear enough. I was discarded, Damien, and sent somewhere I was expected to disappear quietly." Damien did not have a ready answer for that, and the silence stretched uncomfortably between them, heavy with months of unspoken history neither of them had fully processed until this moment. "Selene's leadership has proven difficult," Damien admitted finally, his voice careful, as though the words cost him something to speak aloud. "The pack has struggled under her guidance in ways I did not anticipate." "That is not my concern," Elena said, though she felt no particular satisfaction in his admission, only a quiet, distant sadness for the version of her life that had once seemed so certain before it collapsed entirely in a single evening. "I am not asking for your sympathy," Damien said, straightening slightly, some of his usual composure returning. "I am asking whether Ashwood's coalition intends to remain a regional arrangement, or whether it intends to eventually challenge the capital's authority directly." Elena considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said next would likely shape the kingdom's trajectory for months, perhaps years, to come. "Ashwood's coalition intends to protect the interests of the territories within it," she said finally. "Whether that eventually brings us into conflict with the capital depends entirely on how the capital chooses to respond to our continued growth. If the Crown respects the coalition's independence and treats these territories with the fairness they deserve, there is no reason for conflict. If it does not, then Ashwood, and everything we have built here, will not simply fade quietly away a second time." Damien studied her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes, equal parts respect and unease. "You have changed," he said quietly. "I have grown," Elena corrected. "There is a difference." He did not respond immediately, and Elena watched as something in his posture seemed to settle, as though he had finally arrived at some private conclusion regarding the woman standing before him, no longer the fiancée he had so carelessly discarded, but someone else entirely, someone he had clearly failed to anticipate. "I will need time to consider how the capital wishes to proceed regarding your coalition," Damien said finally. "But I will say this honestly, Elena. Whatever mistakes I made regarding our engagement, I did not anticipate you becoming this." "No," Elena agreed evenly. "I do not imagine you did." Kieran, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward slightly, his presence a quiet reminder that Elena was no longer standing alone in facing whatever came next. Damien's gaze flickered toward him again, something guarded and assessing in his expression, though he said nothing further on the matter. "I will take my leave," Damien said finally. "But this conversation is far from concluded, Elena. The capital cannot simply ignore what you have built here." "I never expected it to," Elena replied. "Safe travels, Damien." He offered a final, measured nod before turning to depart, his guards falling into step behind him as he crossed the hall and disappeared out into the cold winter air. Elena remained standing where she was for a long moment after the doors closed behind him, absorbing the strange weight of the conversation that had just unfolded. "That went better than I expected," Nora said quietly, breaking the silence. "Or considerably worse," Kieran added, his expression thoughtful. "He came here uncertain, Elena. That uncertainty could resolve into respect for what you have built, or it could resolve into fear, and fear from a man with his authority is rarely a comfortable thing to provoke." Elena turned to look at him, something steady and resolved settling over her, despite the lingering tension of the encounter. "Then we will simply have to ensure that whatever he decides, Ashwood, and this coalition, remains strong enough to withstand either outcome." Kieran held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them once again, before offering a small, confident nod. "Agreed," he said quietly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." The days following Damien's visit passed with a tension that settled over Ashwood like a held breath, everyone within the territory aware that something significant had shifted, though the shape of what came next remained uncertain. Elena threw herself into strengthening the coalition further, aware that whatever decision Damien eventually reached, Ashwood would need to be prepared for any outcome. It was during this period of careful preparation that a visitor arrived who would finally reveal the truth Kieran had spent months carefully avoiding. The woman appeared at Ashwood's gates on a gray afternoon, elderly and travel-worn, but with a bearing that immediately marked her as someone of considerable importance, despite her modest clothing. She asked specifically for Kieran by name, refusing to state her business to anyone else, and when Elena brought word of the visitor to him, she watched something she had never seen before cross his face. Genuine fear. "Who is she?" Elena asked, studying his reaction carefully. Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, before he finally answered. "Her name is Ivy Lang. She served my family many years ago, before circumstances forced us apart. If she has found me here, it means something has changed regarding matters I have kept from you far longer than I should have." "Kieran," Elena said carefully, I think it is time you told me the truth. He met her gaze steadily, something resigned settling over his features. Yes, he agreed quietly. I believe it is. They met with Ivy Lang privately in Elena's small study, the older woman settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone whose journey had been long and difficult. She studied Kieran for a long moment before speaking, her eyes glistening with an emotion Elena could not fully name. You have grown into your father's bearing, Ivy said softly. I would have known you anywhere, even after all these years. Kieran's expression tightened. Ivy, please, whatever you have come to say, I would rather hear it plainly. Ivy nodded slowly, then turned her attention to Elena, studying her with careful assessment before returning her gaze to Kieran. Very well. I have come because the Ashcroft bloodline can no longer remain hidden, Kieran. Too many have begun to notice the resemblance, the manner, the leadership you have quietly built among the outer territories. It is only a matter of time before the truth reaches the capital, regardless of your intentions to keep it concealed. Elena felt something shift uncomfortably in her chest. Ashcroft, she repeated slowly. That name belonged to the royal bloodline that ruled before the Cross family rose to power. Generations ago, I was taught it had died out entirely. That is what the Cross family wished the kingdom to believe, Ivy said, her voice carrying the weight of old grief. The Ashcroft line was not extinguished through natural causes, Lady Elena. It was deliberately erased through violence, decades ago, when the Cross family seized power through force rather than lawful succession. A single infant was smuggled away before the purge could claim him entirely, hidden and raised in secret, far from any territory that might recognize his true bloodline. Elena turned slowly to look at Kieran, understanding dawning with heavy, disorienting clarity. You, she said quietly. You are the last of the Ashcroft line. Kieran met her gaze steadily, though something vulnerable flickered beneath his composed exterior, the first time Elena had ever seen him look truly uncertain. Yes, he confirmed quietly. I have known since I was old enough to understand what it meant. I was raised in secret, moved between safe territories throughout my childhood, taught to conceal my true identity for my own protection. And your interest in the outer territories, Elena said slowly, pieces settling into place. Your knowledge of every struggling pack, your careful proposal for a coalition independent of the capital's authority. This was never simply about protecting Ashwood, was it? Kieran's expression grew serious, though he did not look away. It began as protection, he said honestly. I truly believed, and still believe, that the outer territories deserved better than the neglect they suffered under Cross rule. But I will not deny that I also recognized, from the moment I encountered what you had built here, that a coalition of independent territories represented something far more significant than simple regional cooperation. It represented genuine opposition to a bloodline that seized my family's rightful place through violence. Elena sat back slowly, absorbing the full weight of what she was hearing. Every quiet conversation, every careful evasion, every moment of Kieran's guarded history now made sense in a way that reshaped everything she had believed about their partnership over the past months. Why did you not tell me from the beginning, she asked, though her voice carried more curiosity than accusation. Because revealing my identity too soon would have made every territory I approached suspicious of my true motives, Kieran said honestly. They would have seen me as someone seeking to reclaim a throne through their support, rather than someone genuinely committed to their protection and independence. I needed the coalition to grow strong on its own merits first, built on trust and mutual benefit, before the complications of my bloodline became relevant. And now? Elena asked. Ivy says the truth can no longer remain hidden. Ivy nodded gravely. Whispers have already begun reaching certain circles closer to the capital, Lady Elena. It is only a matter of time before Damien Cross himself learns the truth, if he has not already begun to suspect it. When that happens, Kieran's presence within your coalition will no longer be simply a personal alliance. It will become a direct and undeniable political challenge to the Cross bloodline's claim to the throne itself. Elena absorbed this information carefully, understanding immediately the magnitude of what it meant for everything she had built over the past months. Ashwood's coalition, already a quiet source of concern for the capital, would now be viewed as something far more threatening, a legitimate rival claim to the throne itself. given weight by the last surviving heir of the bloodline the Cross family had violently displaced generations earlier. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "Yes," Kieran agreed. "Which is why I understand, if you wish to reconsider our partnership, now that you know the full truth of what standing beside me actually means." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any sign of manipulation or hidden agenda beneath his admission, but found instead only quiet honesty. A man who had clearly carried this burden alone for a very long time, uncertain how it would be received once finally revealed. "You have been honest with me about everything else," Elena said slowly. "Our alliance, our strategy, the genuine needs of these territories. This revelation does not change the trust we have built these past months, Kieran. It only clarifies the stakes we are now facing together." Something in Kieran's expression eased slightly, relief evident beneath his careful composure. "You are certain?" he asked quietly. "I have already lost a crown once, built on promises that turned out to be worth nothing," Elena said, her voice steady and resolved. "I do not intend to abandon something real, built through genuine partnership and shared purpose, simply because the stakes have grown larger than I initially understood." Ivy watched the exchange between them with careful attention, something like quiet approval settling over her weathered features. "The kingdom will not remain the same once this truth becomes fully known," she said. "Are you both prepared for what comes next?" Elena exchanged a long look with Kieran, feeling the weight of the moment settle over them both. The quiet culmination of everything they had built together since his unexpected arrival at Ashwood's borders months earlier. "We have spent months preparing Ashwood, and this coalition, for exactly this kind of challenge," Elena said finally. "Whatever comes next, we will not face it unprepared." Kieran nodded in firm agreement, something resolute settling into his expression. "Then it is time the kingdom learned the full truth," he said quietly. "Whatever consequences follow, we face them together, exactly as we have faced everything else." News of Kieran's true bloodline reached the capital faster than either Elena or Kieran had anticipated, carried by traitors whose loose tongues proved impossible to fully contain, despite Ivy Lang's careful warnings. Within 2 weeks, the quiet coalition Elena had built through patient, deliberate effort was no longer simply a regional curiosity discussed among traveling merchants. It had become the central concern of every conversation within the capital's palace walls. Damien received the news in his private study, delivered by Edwin with visible unease. "The reports are consistent across multiple sources," Edwin said carefully. "The wolf traveling with Lady Elena's coalition, the one called Kieran, is being identified as the last surviving heir of the Ashcroft bloodline." Damien sat motionless for a long moment, absorbing the full implication of what he was hearing. The Ashcroft name had not been spoken openly within palace walls in decades, deliberately buried beneath generations of careful silence following his own family's rise to power. To hear it resurface now, tied directly to Elena's growing coalition, sent a cold, unwelcome clarity through his understanding of everything that had unfolded since her exile. "You are certain of this?" Damien asked, though something in his expression suggested he already believed it. "As certain as any report reaching us secondhand can be," Edwin said, but the details align too precisely to dismiss as rumor. His age, his bearing, even physical resemblances noted by those who once served under the old Ashcroft rule. "It appears genuine, Your Grace." Damien rose slowly from his desk, moving to the window that overlooked the palace grounds, his mind working through the full weight of what this revelation meant. Elena's coalition had already grown into something he could no longer simply dismiss or ignore. With a legitimate Ashcroft heir standing beside her, that coalition now carried a claim to legitimacy that struck directly at the foundation of his own family's rule. "This cannot be allowed to spread further unchecked," Damien said finally, though his voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "If the outer territories begin to see this coalition as a genuine alternative to Cross rule, supported by a legitimate rival bloodline, we risk losing far more than a handful of struggling outposts." "What are your orders?" Edwin asked carefully. Damien was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all carried significant risk. A direct military response against Ashwood's coalition would confirm every accusation of Cross tyranny that had likely fueled the outer territory's willingness to align with Elena in the first place, potentially driving even more pacts toward open rebellion. Yet allowing the coalition to continue growing unchecked, now bolstered by a legitimate rival claim, risked an even greater loss of authority over time. "I will go to Ashwood myself," Damien said finally. "Not with force, but to negotiate directly, before this situation escalates beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution." Edwin's expression remained carefully neutral, though Damien could sense his advisor's doubt regarding the wisdom of this approach. "And if negotiation fails?" Damien did not have an immediate answer, and the silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, heavy with the weight of decisions that would likely shape the kingdom's future for years to come. Within Ashwood, Elena and Kieran had spent the intervening days carefully preparing for whatever response the capital chose to pursue. The coalition's member territories were informed of Kieran's true identity through careful, controlled communication, framed not as a bid for the throne, but as additional context regarding the alliance's foundational values: independence, fair governance, and protection against the kind of neglect and violence that had once claimed the Ashcroft bloodline itself. The response among coalition members proved more supportive than Elena had initially feared. Rather than viewing Kieran's revealed heritage as a destabilizing complication, most territories saw it as further validation of the coalition's legitimacy, a living connection to a bloodline, remembered by many older wolves as more just than the Cross family's often distant and indifferent rule. "They are rallying around this news rather than fracturing beneath it," Nora observed one evening, reviewing correspondence from various coalition territories, expressing renewed commitment to the alliance. "I did not expect that." "Nor did I, entirely," Elena admitted. "But perhaps it should not surprise us. These territories have suffered years of neglect under Cross leadership. Learning that a legitimate alternative exists, one already proven capable of genuine care for their well-being, offers them something they have not had in a very long time: real hope for meaningful change." Kieran, standing nearby, absorbed this observation with quiet consideration. "Hope is a powerful thing," he said softly, "but it also raises the stakes considerably. If Damien views this coalition as an existential threat to his rule, rather than simply an inconvenience to be managed, his response may prove far less measured than his previous visit." Elena's expression grew serious at the reminder. "Then we continue preparing accordingly," she said firmly. "Strengthen our defenses, reinforce our trade agreements, ensure every territory within this coalition understands exactly what is at stake, and remains committed to standing together, regardless of what pressure the capital attempts to apply." Word soon reached them that Damien was once again traveling toward Ashwood, this time with a considerably larger escort than his previous visit, though still notably short of anything resembling a full military force. Elena received the news with steady calm, having anticipated this moment since Ivy Lang's revelation weeks earlier. "He comes to negotiate, not to fight," Kieran observed, studying the reports of Damien's approaching party. "That is worth noting. A man prepared for open conflict would not travel with such a modest escort." "Or he underestimates what we have built here," Elena countered. "Either way, we meet him prepared, on our own terms, exactly as we did before." When Damien arrived at Ashwood for the second time, the atmosphere within the territory felt markedly different from his previous visit. Coalition representatives from several neighboring territories had gathered within the main hall, a visible demonstration of the alliance's strength and unity that Damien could not fail to notice as he entered. His eyes moved slowly across the assembled representatives before settling on Elena, standing at the center of the hall with Kieran at her side, the full weight of the situation clearly registering behind his carefully composed expression. "It seems the rumors were accurate," Damien said quietly, his gaze shifting deliberately toward Kieran. "You are the Ashcroft heir." "I am," Kieran confirmed steadily, meeting Damien's gaze without hesitation. "A truth I did not reveal lightly, and one I did not use to manipulate this coalition into existence. Everything Ashwood and its allied territories have built together was accomplished through genuine cooperation, long before this truth became relevant to our shared purpose." Damien studied him for a long moment, something complicated and difficult to read passing behind his eyes. "And what exactly is your purpose now, given this revelation? A claim to my throne?" "My purpose remains what it has always been," Kieran said calmly. ensuring these territories receive the protection and fair governance they have long been denied. Whether that ultimately requires a formal challenge to your rule depends entirely on how you choose to respond to what has already been built here. Damian Cross. The hall fell into tense silence, every gathered representative watching the exchange with careful attention, aware that whatever was decided within these walls would likely determine the kingdom's trajectory for years to come. Damian's gaze shifted finally to Elena, something unreadable settling into his expression as he studied the woman who had once stood beside him as his intended queen, now standing instead as the architect of an alliance powerful enough to challenge everything his family had built. "And you, Elena," he said quietly, "what is it you truly want from this confrontation?" Elena held his gaze steadily, feeling the full weight of the moment settle over her, the culmination of everything she had endured and built since that terrible night in the Great Hall so many months earlier. "I want what should have been offered to these territories from the beginning," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "Fair leadership, genuine protection, a kingdom that serves all its people, not only those closest to the throne. Whether that requires your continued rule, reformed and accountable, or something else entirely, depends now on you, Damian, and the choices you make in the days ahead." Damian absorbed her words in heavy silence, the weight of the moment, and everything it represented, settling visibly across his composed features, as the assembled representatives waited to learn what the Alpha King would decide. The silence in Ashwood's main hall stretched long enough that several of the gathered representatives shifted uneasily, aware that the next words spoken would likely shape the kingdom for a generation. Damian stood motionless near the center of the room, his gaze moving slowly between Elena, Kieran, and the assembled alphas who had traveled from their own territories to witness this confrontation. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than the commanding tone Elena remembered from their years together in the capital. "I built my rule believing strength meant control," Damian said slowly, as though working through the thought even as he spoke it aloud. "I believed a kingdom held together through firm authority, through decisions made without needing to explain them to anyone. I see now how much that belief cost the people I was meant to protect." Elena watched him carefully, searching for manipulation beneath his words, but found instead something that looked genuinely difficult for him to voice, a reckoning he had perhaps been quietly approaching since his first uncertain visit to Ashwood months earlier. "I did not come here today prepared to fight a war. I do not believe I could win, nor one I am certain I should win, given everything I have witnessed within these walls," Damian continued. "Ashwood, and this coalition, have accomplished more for these territories in a matter of months than the capital managed in years. I cannot, in honesty, argue that my continued unquestioned rule serves these people better than what has been built here." A murmur passed through the assembled representatives, cautious surprise evident on several faces. Kieran remained still beside Elena, his expression carefully neutral, though she could sense the tension in his posture as he waited to hear where Damian's admission would ultimately lead. "What are you proposing?" Elena asked directly, unwilling to let the moment dissolve into vague sentiment without concrete resolution. Damian met her gaze steadily. "A formal restructuring of the kingdom's governance," he said. "The outer territories, and this coalition, would retain the independence you have already built, formally recognized by the capital, rather than simply tolerated. Kieran's bloodline, and his claim, would be acknowledged openly, not as a rival to be suppressed, but as a legitimate voice in how this kingdom moves forward, alongside my own continued leadership, accountable now to a council drawn from territories across the realm, rather than governing through unchecked authority alone." The hall fell into contemplative silence as the representatives absorbed the significance of what Damian was proposing, a fundamental shift away from the singular, unquestioned rule that had defined cross-leadership for generations. "And Celine?" Elena asked quietly, unable to fully suppress the question, though she was careful to keep her tone free of old bitterness. Something flickered across Damian's expression, complicated and difficult to fully read. "Celine was never prepared for the responsibility I placed upon her," he admitted. "That failure rests with my own poor judgment, not hers alone. She will remain safe and cared for, but she has already indicated her own wish to step back from a role she never truly wanted. once she understood its full weight. Elena absorbed this information quietly, feeling not triumph, but a complicated, settled peace, the closing of a chapter that had once defined the worst night of her life, now resolved without the bitterness she might once have expected to feel. Priya Solane, standing among the assembled coalition representatives, stepped forward with careful authority. "And what role does this proposal envision for Elena Voss, specifically?" she asked directly. "This coalition exists because of her leadership. Any restructuring of the kingdom's governance must reflect that reality honestly." Damien turned to look at Elena directly, something steady and resolved settling into his expression, an acknowledgement that seemed to cost him considerable pride to voice aloud. "Elena built something I failed to build myself, despite every advantage my position afforded me," he said. "I propose that she be recognized formally as sovereign leader of the coalition territories, an equal partner in this kingdom's governance, not subordinate to the capital, but standing alongside it, exactly as her accomplishments here have already proven she deserves." The weight of his words settled over the hall, and Elena felt something shift deep within her chest, the culmination of everything she had endured since that terrible night in the Great Hall, transformed now into something she had never fully allowed herself to imagine reclaiming: genuine, rightful authority, earned entirely through her own hands rather than granted through a marriage contract that had ultimately proven worthless. She turned slightly to look at Kiran, finding steady support and quiet pride in his expression, before addressing the assembled representatives directly. "I did not come to Ashwood seeking a throne," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "I came here discarded, sent away with nothing beyond a bag of belongings and a determination not to be defined by what I had lost. Whatever authority I hold today, I hold because these territories chose to trust me, to build something together through genuine partnership rather than inherited privilege." She paused, meeting Damien's gaze directly one final time. "If this coalition, and these territories, wish for me to continue leading in this capacity, formally recognized and accountable to the people I serve, then I accept that responsibility gladly. But I accept it as Elena Voss, sovereign in my own right, not as anyone's forgotten fiancé reluctantly elevated through circumstance." A murmur of firm approval passed through the assembled representatives, several of the visiting alphas nodding in clear agreement, the weight of months of genuine partnership and mutual trust settling into quiet, unanimous support. Weeks later, beneath a clear winter sky, Ashwood's main square filled with representatives from every territory within the coalition, gathered to witness a coronation entirely different from the one Elena had once expected to receive within the capital's grand hall. There was no silver circlet placed upon her head by a man claiming authority over her future. Instead, Callum Brandt, frail but proud, stood beside her as she accepted a simple crown crafted by Ashwood's own artisans, a symbol not of inherited privilege, but of earned trust and genuine partnership. Kiran stood at her side throughout the ceremony, not as a ruler claiming authority over her, but as an equal partner in the governance they had built together, his own position within the restructured kingdom formally acknowledged alongside her own. As the assembled crowd raised their voices in genuine celebration, Elena looked out over the territory that had once seemed like nothing more than a place of exile, now transformed into the foundation of something far greater than the crown she had lost that terrible night in the capital. She thought briefly of the woman who had walked out of that great hall in humiliated silence, uncertain of what remained ahead of her, and felt a quiet, settled gratitude for everything that difficult journey had ultimately allowed her to become. Damien, watching from among the gathered representatives, offered a final, respectful nod as the ceremony concluded, an acknowledgement that the kingdom he had once ruled through unquestioned authority alone had been permanently and irrevocably reshaped by the woman he had so carelessly discarded. Elena met his gaze steadily across the crowded square, feeling neither triumph nor lingering resentment, only the quiet, settled certainty of a woman who had built her own worth entirely through her own hands, answerable now to no one's expectations beyond her own. The crown he had once given away to someone unprepared to carry its weight had, in the end, found its way to someone who had built her own claim to power through genuine strength, patience, and unwavering resolve, becoming, in every way that mattered, the queen he could never have kept, and the queen he had never truly deserved to lose in the first place. Ashwood Square continued its celebration long into the evening, the winter sky bright with stars above a territory that had once been forgotten, now standing as living proof that the strongest kingdoms were not built through inherited privilege alone, but through the quiet, determined resilience of those willing to build something lasting from nothing at all.